Of all the challenges faced by a combat pilot or an aerial gunner in the Second World War, none was more intellectually demanding, more counterintuitive, and more absolutely critical to survival than the art of deflection shooting. It was a discipline that separated the novice from the ace, the lucky shot from the consistent killer. To master it was to understand the brutal, three-dimensional geometry of death, where success was measured in lead, angle, and time, and failure was a silent, harmless tracery of bullets passing through empty sky. This was the deadly math of a miss. The fundamental problem was simple to state but complex to solve. A stream of machine gun bullets does not travel instantaneously. It takes time to cover the distance between the firing aircraft and the target. During that brief but critical window of flight time, the target aircraft is also moving. Therefore, to ensure the target and the bullets arrive at the same point in space simultaneously, the gunner must not aim at the target he sees, but at the empty space in front of it, a point known as the lead point or future position. This is deflection shooting. The greater the angle of deflection, the difference between the target's flight path and the gunner's line of sight, the more complex the calculation becomes. Imagine a simple scenario: a gunner in a bomber, like a B-17 Flying Fortress, is facing an enemy fighter attacking from the side, a beam attack. The fighter is a blur, crossing his field of view at a closing speed of over 400 miles per hour. If the gunner aims directly at the cockpit of the fighter and fires, his bullets will travel in a straight line to that point. But by the time the bullets arrive, the fighter will have already flown through that space. The bullets will pass harmlessly behind it. This was the most common, and most fatal, error of inexperienced gunners. They shot at where the enemy was, not where he would be. The variables a gunner had to process in a matter of heartbeats were staggering. First and foremost was range. The farther away the target, the longer the bullet's time of flight, and the further ahead the gunner had to aim. Estimating range was a skill in itself, often based on the known wingspan of the enemy aircraft and its apparent size. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 at 100 yards was a massive, clear target requiring minimal lead. That same aircraft at 700 yards was a tiny speck, and the required lead could be several of its own lengths. Next was the angle off. Our dead astern, or head-on shot, where the target is flying directly towards or away from the gunner, is a no-deflection shot. The relative speed is high, but the lead calculation is straightforward: aim directly at the target. The true challenge began as the angle increased. A 45-degree crossing shot required a significant lead. A 90-degree beam shot, as in our earlier example, required the maximum possible lead. The gunner had to visually judge this angle and instinctively translate it into a corresponding lead distance. Then came the closing speed. This was a combination of the speeds of both aircraft and their vectors. Two aircraft flying in the same direction had a low closing speed, making the lead smaller. Two aircraft flying directly towards each other created a massive closing speed, but again, in a straight line. The most difficult problem was a high-speed crossing engagement, where the combined velocities created a complex vector that the gunner's brain had to solve instantly. Finally, there were the ballistics of his own weapons. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun, the standard American aerial weapon, fired a heavy projectile at a high velocity, but it was still subject to gravity and aerodynamic drag. At very long ranges, the bullet would drop noticeably and lose energy and velocity. The gunner had to compensate not only for the target's movement but for the arc of his own bullets. In the early years of the war, this immense cognitive load was placed almost entirely on the gunner's instinct and limited training. He was taught with simple rules of thumb: lead by one ring on the gun sight for a crossing shot, or aim 2 plane lengths ahead. But these were gross approximations, useless against a skilled, jinking pilot. The result was a prodigious waste of ammunition. Statistics from the early air war over Europe were sobering. It often took thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, sometimes tens of thousands, to score a single confirmed kill. Streams of tracer fire would lace the sky, curving behind the enemy fighters as they executed their attacks unscathed. Every missed burst was a testament to a miscalculation in this deadly math. It was a problem that was bleeding the Allied air forces dry, and its solution would require not just better training, but but a technological revolution that could perform these lightning-fast calculations for the man in the cockpit. The sky was a lethal geometry exam, and too many were failing. The early air war of World War II was a brutal, unforgiving laboratory where the principles of aerial gunnery were written not in training manuals, but in the blood of aircrews and the burning wreckage of their aircraft. The doctrine of deflection shooting, while understood in theory by a handful of pre-war experts, was a distant abstraction to the thousands of young men rushed through training and thrown into the cauldron of combat over Europe and the Pacific. Their journey from novice to veteran was paved with costly, often fatal, errors that revealed the profound chasm between peacetime theory and the chaotic reality of aerial combat. The primary and most devastating mistake was the instinctual one, aiming directly at the target. The human brain is wired for straightforward trajectories. When throwing a ball or shooting a rifle at a stationary target, one aims directly at the desired point of impact. This deeply ingrained instinct was the gunner's and pilot's greatest enemy. In the heat of a high-speed attack, with adrenaline coursing through their veins and the terrifying sight of an enemy fighter filling their vision, trainees reverted to this basic programming. They would focus on the sleek shape of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the Mitsubishi A6M0, their tracers reaching out for the fuselage and wings they could see, only to watch in dismay as the enemy plane flew serenely through the center of their bullet stream, completely untouched. The bullets were arriving at a point in space the enemy had already vacated. This phenomenon was most tragically evident in the experiences of the American heavy bomber crews in 1942 and 1943. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were equipped with multiple .50 caliber machine gun positions, creating a theoretical hemisphere of fire that doctrine suggested was impregnable. This belief in formation firepower was shattered over German targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg. German fighter pilots, particularly the Focke-Wulf FW-190 pilots, quickly learned the deficiencies of American gunnery. They developed highly effective attack profiles that exploited this predictable error. Instead of engaging in protracted, turning dogfights, German pilots executed high-speed slashing attacks. A favorite tactic was their head-on pass against the bomber stream. While this seems like a no-deflection shot, the closing speed was astronomical, often exceeding 500 miles per hour. A gunner aiming directly at the nose of the oncoming FW-190 would find his bullets passing harmlessly behind it. The lead required, even for a straight-line approach, was substantial. Other attacks came from the beam or from high frontal quarters, angles that demanded significant deflection. The German pilots would hold their fire until the last possible second, then unleash a devastating burst of cannon and machine gun fire as they closed, knowing that the return fire was likely to be poorly aimed. The result was catastrophic loss rates, with missions sometimes losing over 20% of their aircraft. The cost of these early mistakes was measured in more than just lost planes. It was measured in the lives of highly trained and irreplaceable aircrew. Each B-17 carried 10 men, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners. A single aircraft shot down meant 10 men killed, captured, or missing. The morale of the bomber crews, witnessing their comrades falling in flames around them, plummeted. The belief in the unescorted daylight bombing campaign, the core tenet of the USAAF strategic doctrine, teetered on the brink of collapse. The Luftwaffe was winning the battle of attrition because American gunners could not solve the deflection problem consistently. For fighter pilots, the stakes were just as high, but the dynamics were different. The early Allied fighters like the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and the early model Supermarine Spitfires often found themselves outmaneuvered by the more agile German and Japanese fighters. In a turning dogfight, the temptation was to pull the nose of one's aircraft directly onto the enemy and fire. This pull-through method rarely worked against a competent pilot who was constantly turning. The bullets would always arrive behind the target. Pilots who survived their first few encounters quickly learned that success required a different technique. They had to lead the turn, firing at a point ahead of the enemy's flight path, walking the tracers into him. This was a skill born of experience, and the tuition was paid for by those who did not learn it in time. The problem was compounded by inadequate training. Pre-war gunnery practice often involved firing at stationary ground targets or towed sleeves in predictable, straight-line passes. This did little to prepare gunners for a FW-190 diving out of the sun at a 60-degree angle off. The sheer volume of fire needed to score a lucky hit was staggering. It was not uncommon for a bomber to expend tens of thousands of rounds on a mission for a single, probable, kill. This inefficiency had logistical consequences as well, straining the supply chain and adding weight to aircraft that needed every ounce of performance. The sky, therefore, was a cruel teacher. The lessons were written in the vapor trails of dying aircraft and the grim mission reports detailing losses. But from this costly trial and error, a desperate realization began to emerge. The current methods were unsustainable. Instinct was a faulty guide. A solution was needed, one that could translate the complex variables of range, speed, and angle into a simple, visual cue for the man behind the gunsight. The pressure of these early, bloody mistakes became the catalyst for a revolution that would ultimately tilt the balance of power in the air war. The era of guesswork was coming to a fiery end. The fundamental challenge of aerial gunnery, the core reason why aiming directly at an enemy aircraft was a recipe for failure, can be distilled into a single, powerful concept: the hunter's paradox. It is the counterintuitive reality that to hit a moving target, you must deliberately aim at the empty space it has not yet occupied. This paradox stems from the immutable laws of physics, and overcoming it required a mental leap that defied deep-seated human instinct. The failure to make this leap in the early stages of the air war cost countless lives and missions. To understand the paradox, one must first abandon the concept of a static battlefield. Aerial combat is a fluid, three-dimensional ballet of moving platforms. A gunner firing from a B-17 Flying Fortress was not a stationary rifleman on the ground. He was himself a moving point of origin. His bullets inherited the velocity and vector of his own aircraft before they even left the muzzle. This created a complex interplay of motions that had to be reconciled in the gunner's mind. The most critical element was time of flight. A .50 caliber bullet traveling at approximately 2,900 feet per second took a tangible amount of time to reach its target. At a range of 600 yards, a typical engagement distance, the bullet's travel time was roughly 0.6 seconds. This is an eternity in a high-speed aerial engagement. In 0.6 of a second, a Focke-Wulf FW-190 traveling at 350 miles per hour, approximately 513 feet per second, would cover a distance of over 300 feet, more than half the length of a football field. A gunner who aimed his bullets at the FW-190's position at the moment he fired would see them arrive in the space where the fighter had been, a clean mist trailing behind the enemy's tail. This led to the concept of lead. The gunner had to project the target's future position and aim there, creating an intercept point. The required lead was not a fixed measurement. It was a dynamic calculation based on two primary factors: the target's speed and the angle of deflection. A target flying directly away, zero deflection, required minimal lead, as the relative motion was almost purely along the line of sight. However, as the angle between the gunner's line of sight and the target's flight path increased, so did the required lead. A target in a pure beam attack, crossing at a 90-degree angle, demanded the maximum lead. The gunner had to visualize an invisible football field in the sky and aim several aircraft lengths ahead of his target. The situation was further complicated by relative motion. A gunner in a bomber trying to track a fighter making a beam attack was faced with a disorienting phenomenon. The fighter, though traveling at immense speed, might appear to be moving slowly or even floating across his field of vision if it was at a long range. This slow apparent movement was a dangerous illusion. The gunner's instinct would be to apply a small, corresponding lead. In reality, the fighter's high actual speed combined with the angle meant the required lead was vast. This was the heart of the hunter's paradox: the target that appeared to be moving slowly actually required the most aggressive lead. Conversely, a fighter in a high-speed head-on pass appeared to be a blur, screaming towards the bomber. The instinct was to fire wildly with a huge lead, but because the angle was near zero, the required lead, while still significant, was more manageable and had to be applied with precision along a straight line. For fighter pilots, the paradox was even more pronounced. In a turning dogfight, the natural tendency was to pull lead through the turn, trying to get the gunsight directly on the enemy aircraft. However, this method, known as pulling through, almost always resulted in the pilot overshooting the required lead. He would end up firing behind the target. The correct technique, known as leading the turn, involved placing the gun sight ahead of the enemy's flight path and maintaining that lead, allowing the enemy to fly into the bullet stream. This felt unnatural, as if the pilot was aiming at nothing. It required faith in geometry over instinct. The human brain, magnificent as it is poorly equipped to perform these complex vector calculations subconsciously in a life-or-death situation filled with terror and sensory overload. Fear and adrenaline amplify instinct, not complex reasoning. The default setting, aim at the threat, was therefore almost impossible to override through willpower alone. Gunners and pilots would see their tracers, often one in every 5 rounds, curving behind the enemy aircraft, a glowing path highlighting their failure. They would see the enemy pilot, seemingly oblivious to the storm of metal passing harmlessly behind his tail, calmly lining up his own deadly attack. This repeated, visceral failure demonstrated that willpower and courage were not enough. The hunter's paradox could not be solved by simply telling a man to aim ahead. The variables were too many, the time too short, the pressure too great. The solution had to be external. It had to be a tool that could absorb the complex inputs of the engagement and present a simple, unambiguous point of aim, transforming an intellectual puzzle into a straightforward act of alignment. The paradox demanded a technological key, and the relentless pressure of combat was about to provide it. The war in the air was not only fought over the skies of Europe and the Pacific, it was also fought in makeshift classrooms and intelligence huts on airbases across England, Italy, and the Pacific Islands. Here, amidst the smell of damp earth, coffee, and chalk dust, the Allies began to systematically dismantle the hunter's paradox. Their most crucial tool in this educational revolution was not a new weapon, but a simple camera, the gun camera, or gun cam. This unassuming piece of technology became the single most effective instructor in the Allied arsenal, transforming aerial gunnery from an art of instinct into a science of precision. Before the widespread analysis of gun camera footage, a pilot's or gunner's combat report was often a subjective, adrenaline-fueled account. Claims were made in the heat of the moment, A probable, A damaged, A flamer. Debriefing officers would piece together the narrative of an engagement from these often contradictory accounts. But the gun camera provided an unbiased, mechanical witness. Activated the moment the trigger was pressed, it filmed through a lens aligned with the aircraft's guns, recording exactly what the pilot saw in his sights and where his bullets were intended to go. When the film was developed and projected onto a screen back at the base, it told an unvarnished, often humbling, truth. The viewing sessions were a form of collective therapy and education. Pilots and gunners would gather, their successes and failures laid bare for all to see. The footage was a brutal revealer of common, costly errors. Time and again, the same pattern emerged on the flickering screen. A pilot would dive on an enemy aircraft, his sight squarely on the fuselage. He would press the trigger, and the camera would record the tracers, those glowing rounds meant to guide his aim, streaming out and curving behind the target. The enemy aircraft would fly serenely through the center of the bullet stream, completely untouched. The film provided incontrovertible proof of the hunter's paradox. It showed pilots that their instincts were lying to them. They were, in fact, aiming directly at the enemy, and it was precisely why they were missing. This visual evidence was more powerful than any lecture from a training officer. A pilot could see with his own eyes the consequences of his miscalculation. He could see the exact number of plane lengths he was behind his target. He could observe how the lead changed with different attack angles. A beam attack required a massive, seemingly exaggerated lead, while a stern chase required a much finer, more precise adjustment. The gun camera translated abstract concepts like angle off and closure rate into tangible, measurable distances on a screen. The analysis became increasingly sophisticated. Instructors would pause the film at the moment the trigger was pressed and draw a circle on the screen around the spot where the pilot should have been aiming, the future position. They would then let the film run, showing the enemy aircraft flying directly through that circled area, validating the theory. They studied the footage of aces, men like Francis, Gaby, Gabreski or Richard Bong, to deconstruct their technique. The films of successful pilots showed a commonality: they were not pulling the trigger when the sight was on the enemy, but when it was on the empty space in front of them. Their tracers appeared to walk into the lead point, and the enemy would then fly into the devastating stream. For bomber gunners, the lessons were equally vital. Film from the chin turrets of B-17s or the tail gun positions of B-24s showed gunners frantically tracking incoming fighters, their tracers consistently painting a path behind the swift German attacks. Analysts could pinpoint the exact moment a gunner began to apply correct lead, seeing the tracers creep closer and finally connect with the engine or cockpit of a FW-190 or BF-109. They studied the effective firing ranges, learning that opening fire at 800 yards was largely wasteful, while holding fire until 400 yards dramatically increased the probability of a kill. This feedback loop, from combat, to film, to analysis, to revised training, and back to combat, was rapid and relentless. The gun camera became the core of a new, data-driven approach to training. It allowed for the creation of realistic training films that showcased both common errors and exemplary techniques. It provided a standardized way to assess a pilot's or gunner's skill before he ever faced a live enemy. The classroom, armed with the objective truth of the gun camera, became the crucible where new doctrines were forged. The vague instruction to aim ahead was replaced with specific, evidence-based lessons. For a 30-degree deflection shot at 300 yards, lead by 2 wingspans. The gun camera had done more than just record the air war, it had provided the key to winning it, by turning the costly mistakes of the past into the lethal skills of the future. The chaotic, visceral reality of aerial combat belied an underlying mathematical purity. Behind every successful burst of gunfire, every spiraling enemy aircraft, was a complex and instantaneous calculation of physics. The science of the kill was the process of translating the dynamic variables of a moving target, its speed, its angle, and its range, into a single, precise point in the sky, the lead point. Mastering this science was the difference between a novice who wasted ammunition and an ace who made every round count. It was a discipline that fused geometry, ballistics, and intuition. The foundational equation, though never formally solved in the cockpit, was one of simple distance, rate, and time. The core problem was this: a bullet takes time, t, to travel from the gun to the target's current position. In that same time, t, the target will have moved a certain distance, d. Therefore, to hit the target, the gunner must aim a distance, d, ahead of it. The calculation for this required lead distance is deceptively straightforward: lead, d, equals target speed, vt, x time of flight, t. The immense difficulty, of course, lay in determining the variables for this equation in a split second. Time of flight, t, was itself a function of range, r, and the bullet's velocity, vb, which was not constant but decreased due to drag. A .50 caliber bullet lost significant speed over hundreds of yards, meaning the time of flight was not a linear function. At 300 yards, the time of flight was brief; at 600 yards, it was significantly longer, demanding a proportionally larger lead. This is why gunners were trained to hold their fire until the target was at an effective range, where the time of flight variable became more manageable and the bullet retained enough energy to be lethal. The target speed, Vt, was not its true airspeed, but its component of speed perpendicular to the gunner's line of sight. This is where the critical factor of angle off, A, entered the scientific picture. A target moving directly away or toward the gunner has a near-zero lateral speed component, regardless of its actual velocity. Its motion is almost entirely along the line of sight. However, as the angle off increases, so does the lateral component of its speed that the gunner must counteract. The trigonometric function that governs this is the sine. The lateral speed component is equal to the target's true speed multiplied by the sine of the angle off. Lateral speed equals Vt, sin, A. This meant that a target in a pure 90-degree beam attack, where sin, 90, equals 1, was presenting its full speed as lateral motion, requiring the maximum possible lead. A target at a 30-degree angle off, where sin, 30, equals 0.5, was presenting only half of its speed as lateral motion, requiring half the lead of the beam shot. This geometric relationship was the reason why crossing shots were so difficult. The gunner's brain had to instinctively perform this trigonometric calculation, judging the angle and then applying the appropriate sign-based multiplier to the target's estimated speed. To synthesize these variables, pilots and gunners were taught to use a mental model known as the ring and bead, or line of sight, method. They would visualize the target's path and their own bullet stream as two converging lines. Their task was to manipulate their own aircraft or turret to make these lines intersect at the target's future position. The rate of closure, how quickly the target was moving across their field of vision, was the key visual cue. A target that appeared to be moving slowly across the windscreen required a small lead, a target that zipped rapidly across required a large one. This apparent rate was the brain's subconscious way of processing the combination of range, speed, and angle off. The final layer of complexity was bullet ballistics. The bullet did not travel in a straight line. As soon as it left the barrel, gravity began to pull it downward. In a long-range shot, this bullet drop was significant. Furthermore, the bullet was susceptible to wind drift and the slipstream of the firing aircraft itself. A gunner firing from the side waist position of AB-17 had to compensate for the 150+ mph airflow rushing past his opening, which could deflect his bullets. All of this science had to be compressed into a single, fluid motion. There was no time for conscious calculation. The process became one of trained instinct, a feel developed through countless hours of practice and reinforced by the stark lessons of gun camera footage. The pilot or gunner would 1. Estimate the range. 2. Judge the angle off and the target's flight path. 3. Visually assess the rate of closure and lateral movement. 4. Instinctively apply the required lead, a product of speed, angle, and time of flight. 5. Adjust for bullet drop by aiming slightly above the target for longer ranges. 6. Walk the tracers onto the calculated lead point, making fine corrections until the stream of bullets began to connect. The science of the kill was therefore a brutal exercise in applied physics. It was a testament to the human brain's ability to solve complex spatial problems under extreme duress. But the limitations of this unaided human computer were clear. The solution, born from this understanding of the underlying science, was to create a mechanical computer that could perform these lightning-fast calculations automatically, presenting the answer as a simple glowing pipper in the pilot's windscreen. The science had been defined, now, it was time for the engineering to catch up. The limitations of the human mind in solving the complex physics of deflection shooting under combat conditions were starkly apparent by 1943. The science was understood, but its practical application remained elusive for the average pilot or gunner. What was needed was a technological leap, a device that could absorb the variables of the engagement and present a simple, unambiguous firing solution. The answer emerged not from a single breakthrough, but from a convergence of optics, gyroscopes, and ballistics, culminating in the invention of the modern gyroscopic gun sight. This was not an incremental improvement, it was a revolution that fundamentally changed the lethality of every Allied fighter and bomber. The journey began with the refinement of the simple reflector sight. This sight projected an illuminated aiming reticle, often a circle with a dot in the center, onto a glass screen in front of the pilot. The key advantage was that the reticle appeared to be at optical infinity, meaning the pilot did not have to constantly refocus his eyes between the close-up sight and the distant target. This was a significant step forward from primitive iron sights, but it was still a fixed sight. The pilot still had to manually estimate and apply the correct lead, using the circle's diameter as a crude ruler. It aided in aiming, but it did not solve the calculation problem. The revolutionary leap was the integration of a gyroscope. A gyroscope resists changes to its orientation, providing a stable reference point in a moving, turning aircraft. Engineers realized that this property could be used to measure the rate of a pilot's turn. And in a tracking scenario, the rate of turn required to keep the gun sight on a moving target is directly proportional to the required lead angle. This was the fundamental insight. The gyroscopic gun sight did not calculate lead based on estimated range and speed, it calculated it based on the pilot's own control inputs as he tracked the target. The most famous of these, and the one that became synonymous with Allied air superiority in the latter half of the war, was the British-developed Mark II gyroscopic gun sight, GGS, and its American derivative, the K-14. To use the K-14, a pilot first had to perform one critical action. He dialed in the target's wingspan using a knob on the throttle or control panel. This single input, combined with the gyroscope's magic, unlocked the entire firing solution. Here is how it worked. The pilot would spot an enemy aircraft and begin to maneuver his aircraft to keep the fixed pipper, their death dot, on the target. As he turned, the gyroscope inside the sight would measure the rate of this turn. The sight's internal mechanical computer, a marvel of cams, gears, and springs, would then use this turn rate and the preset wingspan to dynamically calculate the correct lead. It would project a moving, expanding reticle, a ladder, or circle of diamonds, ahead of the fixed pipper. The genius of the system was its feedback loop. The harder the pilot had to turn to track the target, indicating a high angle, high-speed crossing shot, the further ahead the gyroscopic reticle would move, demanding more lead. If the target was flying a straighter path, a low deflection shot, the reticle would stay closer to the fixed pipper. The pilot's only task was to keep the target's wingspan framed within the moving gyroscopic reticle and press the trigger. The sight was, in effect, using the target's known size to constantly solve for range. A large aircraft at a distance would subtend the same visual angle as a small aircraft up close. By forcing the pilot to match the wingspan to the reticle, the sight effectively knew the range and could adjust the lead accordingly. The first encounters with the new sight were often met with skepticism from veteran pilots, who trusted their hard-won instincts. But its effectiveness was undeniable. In training, the difference was immediately obvious. Pilots using the old fixed sights would watch their tracers curve behind a towed target sleeve. Pilots using the K-14, by simply keeping the sleeve's wingspan within the dancing reticle, would see their rounds strike the target with stunning consistency, often on the first burst. In combat, the impact was transformative. A pilot diving on a German fighter no longer had to guess whether to lead by 2, 4, or 6 plane lengths. He simply dialed in the wingspan of a Bf-109, 32 feet, or a FW-190, 34 feet, placed the pipper on the fuselage, and let the sight do the math. The gyroscopic reticle would float out in front, and when the enemy filled the designated space, a quick burst would yield results that seemed like magic. It democratized the skills of an ace. A rookie with 100 hours in a Mustang, equipped with a K-14, could now achieve a level of gunnery accuracy that had previously required 500 hours of combat experience and innate talent. For bomber gunners, whose firing positions were more stable, the principle was adapted into the Norden and Spey computing sights used in power turrets. These systems used gyros to measure the rate of traverse and elevation of the turret itself, automatically applying the correct lead for the gunner. He simply had to keep the reticle on the target, and the electromechanical computer would ensure the guns were pointed at the future position. The invention of the modern gun sight was the culmination of the gunnery revolution. It was the physical embodiment of the science of the kill. It took the abstract concepts of lead, angle, and speed and rendered them into a simple, visual command for the pilot: put the enemy here, and shoot. By offloading the cognitive burden of calculation onto a mechanical computer, it allowed the human operator to focus on the higher-order tasks of tactics, situational awareness, and survival. It doubled, and in some cases tripled, the effectiveness of Allied gunnery, turning the tide of the attritional air war and ensuring that when an Allied pilot had an enemy in his sights, it was most likely a killing blow. The arrival of the gyroscopic gun sight in the squadrons of the USAF and RAF in 1944 did not automatically confer instant supremacy. The most sophisticated technology is useless without the trained human operator to wield it effectively. Thus, alongside the technological revolution occurred a parallel and equally vital training revolution. A new generation of pilots and gunners had to be educated not to trust their gut, but to trust the machine. They had to make the fundamental shift from instinctive shooting to instrument-guided precision, a transition that reshaped the entire pipeline of aircrew training from the classrooms of Texas to the combat skies over Berlin. The old training methods, which emphasized instinct and rough rules of thumb, were abruptly obsolete. The new curriculum, built around the K-14 and its British counterparts, was a lesson in disciplined procedure. The first and most critical step was aircraft recognition. A pilot had to instantly identify an enemy aircraft and know its wingspan to the foot. Misdialing the wingspan was a catastrophic error. Setting the sight for a Focke-Wulf FW190's 34-foot wingspan when engaging a Messerschmitt Bf 109 with a 32-foot span would cause the sight to calculate an incorrect lead, sending the bullet stream harmlessly ahead of or behind the target. Flashcards, silhouette drills, and recognition models became a relentless part of a pilot's daily life. The gun sight had made them, in a small way, amateur metrologists. On the ground, trainers used detailed mock-ups of the sight to drill the new methodology into muscle memory. The sequence was simple but had to be performed flawlessly under stress: spot, identify, dial, track, frame, fire. Their dial step was the new, non-negotiable action that separated the new breed from the old. Instructors hammered home that the gyroscopic reticle was not a suggestion, it was the solution. The fundamental discipline was to avoid the urge to eyeball the lead and instead to have the faith to place the target within the moving diamonds, even if it felt counterintuitively far ahead. This theoretical knowledge was then put to the test in the air. Their humble-toed target sleeve, once used for crude tracking practice, became the proving ground for the new technology. A student pilot would take off in his AT-6 Texan or a combat-ready P-51 Mustang, his guns loaded with frangible or color-tipped ammunition. He would pursue the sleeve, and the instructor, either flying alongside or monitoring from the ground, would demand a disciplined attack. The student was required to call out his identification and the wingspan setting before he even began his run. Bandit, 12 o'clock. FW 190. Setting 34 feet. As he maneuvered behind the tow plane, the student fought his instincts. The sleeve, buffeted by prop wash and wind, would dance in his windscreen. His ingrained habit was to pull the pipper directly onto the cloth target and fire. But now, the gyroscope, sensing his turn rate, would project the ladder reticle out in front. The command was to ignore the pipper and focus entirely on framing the sleeve within the expanding and contracting diamonds. When he pressed the trigger, the result was immediate feedback. The colored ammunition would paint the sleeve. A tight, concentrated pattern of hits confirmed a perfect execution. A scattered pattern, or worse, no hits at all, signaled a reversion to instinct. Likely, he had fired at the fixed pipper instead of the gyroscope reticle. The gun camera was, as always, the ultimate arbiter. Film from training flights was scrutinized frame by frame. Instructors could see the moment a student's discipline broke, watching the pipper drift off the target as he tried to chase the gyroscope reticle instead of smoothly tracking and letting the reticle do their work. They could see the results of an incorrect wingspan setting. This objective evidence accelerated the learning curve dramatically. A pilot could see his own mistakes and correct them on his next flight. For veteran pilots transitioning to new aircraft equipped with the sight, the process could be a humbling experience. Men who had scored kills using the old pull-through method often initially distrusted the jittering automated reticle. It felt like a mechanical interloper in the intimate dance of the dogfight. However, once they witnessed its accuracy on the gunnery range, often achieving scores double or triple what they could manage with a fixed sight, skepticism quickly turned to evangelism. These seasoned pilots became the most effective instructors, their endorsement lending crucial credibility to the new technology. The training extended to bomber gunners as well. Those manning the power turrets of B-17s and B-24s were trained on the computing sites that used the same gyroscopic principles. They practiced tracking incoming fighter drones, learning to trust the automated lead provided by their sights rather than trying to Kentucky windage their shots. They drilled on shifting between different aircraft types, quickly adjusting their aim for the different closure rates and profiles of a head-on Zeke versus a beam-attacking Tony. This comprehensive, technology-centric training program created a force of aerial marksmen of unprecedented consistency. By the time these new pilots and gunners reached their combat squadrons in the final year of the war, the methodology was second nature. They entered the fray not as individuals relying on variable talent and luck, but as system operators, each wielding a standardized, lethal tool. The shift from instinct to instrument was a cultural and tactical metamorphosis. It ensured that the revolutionary potential of the gyroscopic gun sight was fully realized, turning the Allied air forces into a precision-guided force that could systematically and efficiently dismantle the Luftwaffe and Japanese air power with a cold, mechanical certainty that no amount of innate skill alone could ever provide. The ultimate test of any military technology is not on the training range, but in the crucible of combat. For the gyroscopic gun sight, its validation came from the most respected and feared judges in the aerial arena, the fighter aces. These men, whose survival and success were built on a foundation of supreme skill and sharpened instinct, were initially the most skeptical of the new gizmo in their cockpits. Yet, when they overcame their reservations and integrated the K-14 into their combat methodology, the results were so dramatic that they became the site's most powerful advocates. Their combat reports and personal testimonies provided irrefutable proof that the revolution was real. The skepticism was understandable. An ace like Francis Gaby Gabreski or Richard Bud Peterson had honed his marksmanship through dozens of harrowing engagements. He had developed a deeply personal feel for deflection, a subconscious calculus that told him precisely how far to lead a Focke-Wulf 190 in a high-speed dive or a Messerschmitt 109 in a climbing turn. This skill was his edge, his life insurance. The idea of surrendering that hard-won instinct to a jittering set of glowing diamonds was, to many, anathema. Early encounters with the sight often involved pilots ignoring the gyroscope reticle altogether, using the fixed pipper as a slightly improved reflector sight. Old habits, especially those that kept one alive, died hard. The conversion typically happened in one of two ways: through forced adoption or dramatic demonstration. In some units, commanders, convinced by training data, mandated the use of the gyroscopic sight. Pilots were ordered to dial in wingspans and use the computed lead for their attacks. Grudgingly, they complied. The results, captured on gun camera footage, were startling. Pilots who had previously scored hits through bursts of sustained fire now saw their targets disintegrate after a short, precise burst. The efficiency was undeniable. The sight wasn't just helping them hit, it was helping them kill faster and with less ammunition. For others, the revelation came from watching a fellow pilot, often a younger, less experienced one, achieve remarkable results. A veteran ace might spend a long, turning engagement trying to get a killing solution on an evasive German fighter, firing several bursts that only scored minor hits. Then, a wingman, calmly using his K-14, would slide into position, fire a single, economical burst from a seemingly impossible angle, and watch the enemy aircraft explode. In the debrief, the wingman would explain simply, "I just put the reticle on him, framed his wingspan, and fired." The evidence was impossible to ignore. The tactical advantages reported by the aces were multifaceted. First and foremost was the expansion of the effective firing envelope. With the fixed sight, a high deflection shot was a low percentage gamble. With the K-14, aces found they could open fire from positions they would previously have considered useless. A beam attack on a German fighter, once a difficult proposition, became a viable and deadly tactic. The sight calculated the massive lead required, and the pilot needed only to keep the target framed. This allowed them to engage sooner, from more angles, denying the enemy any safe approach. Second was the dramatic conservation of ammunition. An ace using his instinct might need a 3 to 4 second burst to warp his fire onto a target. Using the K-14, a 1 to 2 second burst was often sufficient. This meant a P-51 Mustang pilot could stay in the fight longer, engaging multiple targets on a single deep penetration escort mission without running his guns dry. This increased sortie effectiveness and survivability, as a pilot with ammunition was a threat, while one without was a vulnerable target. Third, and perhaps most psychologically, was the reduction in pursuit time. Chasing an enemy aircraft through violent maneuvers to get into a close range, low deflection position was time-consuming and dangerous. It exposed the attacker to other enemy fighters and concentrated flak. The K-14 allowed aces to take snap shots from greater range and more difficult angles, shortening the killing process. A pilot could make a single, slashing attack, secure a kill, and immediately break away to assess the tactical situation or engage another threat. It promoted a more fluid, less committed style of attack. The testimony of the aces poured into intelligence reports. They spoke of unbelievable accuracy and impossible shots that now became routine. The sight was credited not just with increasing their kill counts, but with saving their lives by allowing them to dispatch enemies quickly and disengage before the situation turned against them. The gyroscopic sight became a force multiplier for the already deadly, elevating their effectiveness to a new plane. This validation from the elite had a ripple effect throughout the entire fighter force. When a rookie pilot heard that the legendary Colonel Hubert, Hub, Zemke or Major John Godfrey swore by the K-14, any lingering doubt evaporated. The aces became de facto instructors, passing on the techniques and disciplines they had developed. They emphasized the critical importance of the wingspan setting and the need for smooth tracking. The technology, born in the laboratory, was now being refined and mastered by the masters of the air combat art. The proof was indeed in the pursuit. The soaring kill rates of Allied fighter squadrons in 1944 and 1945, and the corresponding devastating losses inflicted on the Luftwaffe and Japanese air forces, were not just a function of superior aircraft numbers. They were a testament to a quantum leap in gunnery accuracy, driven by a technology that had won the ultimate endorsement. The aces had validated the method, proving that when human courage and skill were fused with mechanical precision, the result was an aerial killing machine of unprecedented efficiency. The glowing reticle in the windscreen had become the arbiter of death in the sky, and the best pilots in the world had learned to trust its cold, unerring logic. The B-17 Flying Fortress was more than a bomber, it was a flying community of 10 men, each a specialist entrusted with the survival of the whole. For the gunners manning its 11.50 caliber machine guns, the war was a defensive battle fought from frozen, exposed positions against a relentless and skilled enemy. The challenge of deflection shooting for these men was uniquely daunting. Unlike a fighter pilot who could maneuver his entire aircraft to achieve a firing solution, a gunner was largely trapped in his station, his field of fire dictated by the geometry of the bomber's flight path and the relentless approach of enemy fighters. Their mastery of deflection, therefore, was not a matter of offensive agility, but of disciplined, calculated fire from a stable platform, and their journey to proficiency was written in the same costly lessons as the fighters. Initially, the defensive doctrine of the bomber formations relied on volume of fire. The concept was simple: saturate the sky around the formation with lead, creating a box through which no enemy fighter could fly unscathed. This theory was brutally dismantled over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. German pilots quickly learned that the streams of tracer fire, while terrifying to behold, were almost universally aimed behind them. They exploited this with high speed, slashing attacks from the front and beam, areas where the gunners' deflection challenges were greatest. The .50 caliber rounds, fired in long, wasteful bursts, would curve harmlessly through the air where the FW-190s and Bf-109s had been moments before. The cost of this educational period was measured in hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives. The transformation of the B-17 gunner from a panicked shooter into a master of aerial artillery followed a path parallel to that of the fighter pilots, centered on the analysis of gun camera footage and the implementation of new technology. The gun cameras mounted on the fortresses provided stark, undeniable evidence of the universal failure to lead targets. Instructors at stateside training bases and intelligence officers in England would project the films, freezing the frame to show the enemy fighter positioned perfectly in the center of a stream of tracers that were, in reality, passing far behind it. This visual proof was a powerful pedagogical tool. It replaced abstract advice with concrete, visual evidence of error. Training was revolutionized. Gunners were no longer taught just to identify aircraft, but to instantly estimate their angle off and speed. They practiced on sophisticated trainers that simulated the view from a spey ball turret or a Cheyenne tail gun position, with projected film of German fighters making attacking passes. The key lesson was trigger discipline. Gunners were drilled to not open fire until the enemy was within effective range, typically 400 yards or less. This conserved ammunition, increased the probability of a hit by reducing the time of flight, and prevented the enemy from using the tracer fire to gauge his own evasion. The old method of spray and pray was replaced with a new mantra: aim, lead, short burst. The technological leap for the bombers was the development of the computing gun sight, most notably used in the power-operated turrets. The B-17's chin turret, dorsal turret, and the B-29's sophisticated fire control system used gyroscopes to automatically calculate lead. The gunner's task was simplified to a tracking exercise. He would simply keep his reticle on the target, and the electromechanical computer would adjust the actual aiming point of the guns, factoring in the bomber's own airspeed, the target's relative motion, and bullet drop. This was the defensive equivalent of the K-14 sight, and it was just as revolutionary. For the gunners in non-powered positions, the waist gunners, the tail gunner, and the radio operator manning his ventral gun, the challenge remained immense. These men had to apply lead manually, wrestling their heavy .50 caliber machine guns against the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream. Their skill was a testament to human adaptability and strength. They learned to read the rate of closure of an attacking fighter. A fighter approaching slowly from the beam required a massive, sustained lead. A fighter screaming in from the front required a finer, more precise adjustment. They learned to walk their tracers onto the target, watching the glowing rounds and adjusting their aim until the stream began to connect with the enemy's engine or cockpit. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots facing this newly trained and equipped defensive force was significant. Early in the war, a head-on attack against a B-17 was considered a relatively safe approach. By late 1944, it had become a suicide run. The focused, accurate fire from the chin turrets and nose guns, guided by computing sights, made the bomber's nose a lethal focal point. Similarly, attacks from the beam, once an area of weak gunnery, became killing zones as waist gunners, now better trained and often equipped with improved, compensating sights, learned to lay down a deadly, pre-calculated barrage. The mastery of deflection by the B-17's gunners transformed the strategic bombing campaign. It increased the cost for the Luftwaffe to intercept the bomber streams, contributing to the attrition that bled the German fighter arm white. A formation of B-17s was no longer a passive target, it was a porcupine, its quills aimed with deadly precision. This defensive prowess was a crucial factor in allowing the 8th Air Force to continue its daylight bombing campaign, which ultimately crippled German war industry. The fury of the fortress was no longer just a hopeful name, it was a precise, calculated, and devastating reality, forged in the fires of early failure and refined by technology and training into the most formidable defensive weapon in the sky. Their mastery of deflection shooting, culminating in the widespread use of the gyroscopic gun sight, was not merely an incremental improvement in aerial warfare. It was a paradigm shift that fundamentally altered the strategic equation of the air war over Europe and the Pacific. The simple, counterintuitive act of aiming ahead of the target did more than just increase individual kill ratios, it won the war of attrition, broke the back of enemy air forces, and established a tactical legacy that would define air combat for the next century. The most immediate and decisive impact was on the war of attrition. Air combat, particularly in the European theater, was a brutal numbers game. The Allied strategy of daylight strategic bombing was designed to draw the Luftwaffe up into a battle it could not win, destroying German aircraft and, more importantly, their irreplaceable pilots. For the first years of this campaign, the exchange rate was often in the Luftwaffe's favor. Unescorted bombers were easy prey, and even when fighters were present, the difficulty of scoring a kill meant that many damaged German aircraft could disengage and live to fight another day. The gyroscopic gun sight changed this calculus dramatically. It transformed every P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt from a harasser into a precision killer. A single, short burst was now often lethal. Pilots who might have scored 1 or no kills per mission were now regularly claiming 2 or 3. The result was a catastrophic spike in Luftwaffe losses throughout 1944. They were not just being challenged, they were being systematically exterminated. The skies over Germany became a vacuum cleaner, sucking in and destroying the last reserves of German air power. This tactical advantage created a devastating psychological impact. For a German pilot, the experience of combat changed profoundly. In the past, a skilled pilot could often evade an attacker through aggressive maneuvering, trusting that his opponent's gunfire would be poorly aimed. Now, an attack from almost any angle could be fatal. The sight of a Mustang, even at a seemingly impossible deflection angle, became a portent of doom. The new Allied marksmanship sapped the morale and aggressive spirit of the Luftwaffe. pilots became reluctant to press home their attacks on bomber formations, knowing that the escorting fighters could kill them with efficiency that felt almost supernatural. This erosion of fighting spirit was as critical as the physical loss of aircraft. The strategic consequence of this was air superiority achieved and exploited. With the Luftwaffe being bled white in the defense of the Reich, the Allies gained virtually uncontested control of the skies over Western Europe in time for the D-Day landings. This was not an abstract concept. It meant that Allied troops on the beachhead were free from the threat of German air attack. It meant that reconnaissance aircraft could roam at will, providing critical intelligence on German troop movements. It meant that ground attack aircraft like the P-47 and Typhoon could operate with impunity, decimating German armor and supply lines in the Falaise Gap and beyond. The D-Day landings would have been a far bloodier, and potentially untenable, operation without this hard-won air supremacy, which was forged in no small part by the gunnery revolution. Furthermore, the newfound accuracy extended the effective reach of air power. Bomber crews, now protected by lethally effective escorts, could fly deeper into Germany with a much higher probability of survival. They could focus on their bombing runs rather than constantly evading fighters. The destruction of German oil refineries, aircraft factories, and transportation networks, the core objectives of the strategic bombing campaign, was accelerated dramatically. The Allies were not just dropping bombs, they were surgically dismantling the German war machine, and the precision of their fighter escorts was the scalpel that made it possible. The legacy of aiming ahead extended far beyond the propeller-driven aircraft of World War II. The core principle, that unaided human instinct is insufficient for hitting a high-speed moving target, became a cornerstone of all subsequent air combat. The gyroscopic gun sight was the direct ancestor of the radar-ranging gun sights of the Korean War, the lead computing optical sights of the Vietnam era, and the modern heads-up display, HUD, found in every fighter jet today. When a modern F-22 or F-35 pilot locks onto an enemy aircraft, the computer calculates a steering cue, a pipper, on the HUD. The pilot's task is not to calculate lead, but to maneuver his aircraft to place that pipper on the target. This is the philosophical and technological descendant of the K-14's circle of diamonds. The pilot is still aiming ahead of the target, but now the calculation is performed by a digital computer processing data from radar and sensors, rather than a gyroscope measuring turn rate. The lesson of World War II aerial gunnery is therefore a timeless one: technological superiority, when properly integrated with human training and doctrine, is a decisive force multiplier. The development of the gyroscopic gun sight was a perfect storm of identifying a critical problem, the cost of missed shots, developing a technological solution, the sight, and implementing a systemic training program to ensure its effective use. It was a victory of science over instinct, of quality over quantity. By learning to aim at the empty space ahead of the target, the Allied air forces filled the skies with the wreckage of the Luftwaffe and won the air war, establishing a tactical legacy of precision that continues to define aerial combat to this day.